Okay, we're here to get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to our city council meeting. This is actually, just to clarify, this is a public work session for the city council to evaluate the possibility of creating a conservation easement to protect Lambert Park long-term. Excuse me. And so much of the meeting will be dedicated to a presentation. That always happens. I got to get used to that. We'll have our meeting. We'll start it out with the way we normally do in a city council meeting. But at some point, we will ask our guests to present the presentation on the conservation easement so we can better understand the process and the ramifications of conservation easement. But we'll start with a roll call at that end.
Jason Thielen, present.
Lambert, present.
Jessica Smewen, present.
Lon Lott, present.
And I'm Troy Stout. Do we have Greg online yet? Do we know?
Yes, Greg Gordon, present.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us, Greg. Greg's out of town and has made time to join us tonight. Thank you. We'll start with a prayer by Lon Lott.
Our Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this day to live another day and to enjoy life here in this great country we live in. We're thankful for the opportunity to associate one with another and to live in a community that has beauties and comforts that surround us. We pray that we will be civil in our discussions this day, that calm and collected minds will think through things clearly, that we will do what is right and appropriate. We pray, especially at this time, for moisture. We so need the moisture to wet the parched ground and help us throughout this summer. We pray for these things, Father, in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lon. I've asked Council Member Carla Merrill to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Carla. So normally in a city council meeting, we reserve the next few minutes for public comment. I'm going to ask you all a favor tonight. I know some of you have some things to say and we'd like to hear those things. We'd like to push public comment back to later in the meeting so that we can hear the presentation and become a little bit more educated on the process. And that may answer some of the questions that would come forward. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll have more clarity on some of the steps, some of the ramifications, and your comments will be more succinct to what we still need to hear. So with that, we'll go ahead with and introduce the Executive Director of the Utah Open Lands group, which is, where are you headquartered, Wendy?
Salt Lake City.
In Salt Lake City, okay. Wendy Fisher is the Executive Director of Utah Open Lands, and we've asked her to come and make a presentation to help us understand the process of, and maybe give us some examples of conservation easements that have occurred throughout the state. Before Wendy comes up, I'll just say that many of us here believe that the long-term protection of Lambert Park as a natural open space for the recreational use of the community is a very high priority. And tonight, we are all aware of the pressures put on not only Alpine, but cities throughout Utah for growth and development. And those are good things at the right pace. But I think it behooves us as a group to evaluate what our assets are and what kind of physical assets we want to hang on to for the long-term future. And something like Lambert Park and other open spaces that we have today could be under threat in the future. They're not today. I'm here tonight with a group of people who I am convinced is committed to protecting it long-term. The question is, how is it protected? And under what circumstances and under what guidelines? And if we are to enjoy Lambert Park and other places for the long-term future, for future generations, then we probably need to take a very careful look today at what parameters under which they are protected. And so for that purpose, we've come here tonight to evaluate what some of our options might be that may not just apply to Lambert Park. They may apply to other places in Alpine that are also great that we want to preserve and protect. So with that, I'll let Wendy Fisher come in and take over. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. I feel awkward standing in front of you without being able to address all of you. So I may do this every once in a while. It's part of my theater show. I'm Wendy Fisher. I'm the executive director of Utah Open Lands. And I'm assuming if this is recorded that I probably need to focus mostly on the microphone.
Yeah, and I don't know, forgive me for interrupting. Would it be better for Wendy to present from the table over there where she could face both us and the audience? Do we have
That's
the
okay.
facility to do that?
That's okay.
Okay.
I can do the, 2-foot
Okay.
shuffle. It'll be
Thanks,
fine.
Wendy.
Let's not put too much emphasis on that. Just to give you a little bit of a background about who I am and why I've worked for Utah Open Lands for 30 years. I actually grew up in Utah County. I had a horse that I would ride through the orchards with permission, believe it or not, all the way up to Timpanogos. The place I used to ride from doesn't exist anymore, and the trails I used to ride along do not exist anymore. And it's a sad thing for me because I want to live in a place that has more open space than the place that I grew up at this point. And I miss the orchards. In fact, as I was driving in here today, seeing some of the lovely orchards and open space that you have is really quite heartening and amazing. So we all know that we've all suffered through the COVID times. And I think that one of the things that I would ask really quickly, by a show of hands, how many people got out on trails and recreated even though there was a pandemic? Well, you are not unusual, believe it or not. We found that there was a 300% increase in the amount of people using trails and open space. And that comes from the Governor's Office of Outdoor Recreation. One of the properties that Utah Open Lands worked to protect at the top of Big Cottonwood Canyon is called Bonanza Flat. Has anybody in the room ever gone on the Bloods Lake Trail to Bloods Lake? And was it crowded this last year? We saw 1,000% increase this last year from the last 3 years that we have been doing trail counts on Bonanza. I think one of the things that we've recognized, and it's something that Utah Open Lands has been aware of since we very much began, is that open space actually does make economic sense for a community. And in fact, during the pandemic, one of the statistics that the Governor's Office of Outdoor Recreation has shared with folks is that while a lot of other states constricted in their economy, Utah grew, albeit just by a little bit. But one of the reasons that we grew is because of this access to outdoor recreation. So with that, let me talk a little bit about conservation easements. And you can read the screen. So I am not a fond individual of reading the bullet points. But one of the things I always realize when I talk about conservation easements is they're so familiar to me that I forget to really explain what a conservation easement is. And a conservation easement is a legal binding agreement. It does not give ownership of the land to Utah Open Lands. Rather, what you give to Utah Open Lands is an enforcement right to enforce the protection of the conservation values, whether they be historic, recreational, scenic, wildlife habitat, against those things that could impair those conservation values, things like subdivision and development. So that is essentially what the conservation easement does. If you think about land ownership in terms of a bundle of sticks, we all know that sometimes you buy land and you don't get the water rights. And oftentimes what's common in the West is you don't get the mineral estate. Well, actually, a conservation easement ties the development sticks all in a neat little bundle, puts a bow around it, and gives Utah Open Lands, again, that enforcement right in order to protect the conservation values of the property against things that would damage or impair them. The next slide, please. One of the things that, do I have that ability? Okay. One of the things I love to bring up to folks is our greatest hits album here at Utah Open Lands, because I like to let people know that you might know us from such projects as Bridal Veil Falls, which at the end of 2020, we worked with Utah County to ensure that that iconic piece of property was protected from a potential development that had gained some steam. And yes, it was a publicly owned piece of property, but they chose to put a conservation easement on it to forever protect it for what it's always been, which is that incredible recreational opportunity and iconic scenic value. As many of you know, there's actually a consideration right now. We're working with Representative Kevin Stratton and the Utah legislature to actually look at whether this should become a state park or a state monument. We also have worked with the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, another state agency, placed a conservation easement on the Galena Sunkani property down along the Jordan River in Draper. What we accomplished most recently alongside Bridal Veil Falls at the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon was the protection of the Cottonwood Heights Bonneville Shoreline Trail. That is now protected under a conservation easement with Utah Open Lands. If you've ever been down south to the Moab area, one of the 50 classic climbs in North America, Castleton Tower, although the tower resides on BLM land, the climbers campground was actually protected by Utah Open Lands, 221 acres of land that we now own, and is a free campground open to all who go down there. We recently protected the Armstrong Snow Ranch pastures, and there are many, many other properties that we have protected throughout the state of Utah, about 64,000 acres strong, most with conservation easements, some we actually own in fee. Next slide. Well, why a conservation easement? You know, when you talk about land preservation, there is a toolbox that you can use that has a number of different ways in which you can actually look at preserving land. But a conservation easement, we believe, and after watching too many things happen over the 30 years that I've been involved with Utah Open Lands to lands that were not protected, I think that it's important to have that third-party verification, the third-party enforcement. And yes, down the road, there may be a moment where you wonder whether or not you should sell off part of this for development. Those always end up being sort of rash decisions, and we can talk about that in the future or maybe through public discussion. But we've really found that conservation easements are the best tool to preserve open space. And if I might, I can let you know that right now, for example, restrictive covenants, which are a tool that has been used. In fact, it's used right now to protect part of Sundance Resort. But there is a case going through the Utah court system in which an individual on their property, they violated the restrictive covenants that protected that property. And that is currently going through the court system. So a decision on that may render restrictive covenants less enforceable. And then you look at deed restrictions. There's actually a piece of property of open space that was purchased with bond funds up in Summit County. And actually that deed restriction did not allow for any of that property to be sold off and developed. But in fact, that deed restriction was changed between the grantor and the grantee. And there is now a development on a portion of that property. And then also when you look at unrestricted property, that can be easily changed in the future as well. In fact, there's a piece of property that was legislatively protected, and then a developer got on the board of a public entity and wanted to develop that property. It became an FBI case, actually, at the end of the day. That property is fortunately protected today, but because of all of that, the legislative mandate was actually turned not for the public trust, but actually for a private benefit in that particular instance. So again, these are just a couple of examples of why I believe that conservation easements are really the way to foster the intention of land protection and to ensure it is done in perpetuity. Next slide. And I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that there is a lot of flexibility when you start looking at the protection of a piece of property through a conservation easement. I like to think of it in terms of things that a lot of people can understand. For example, Typically, when you live in a subdivision, you have covenants, codes, and restrictions that I think are very familiar to people. Well, those all get orchestrated sometimes during the development process with a city, sometimes it's within the community itself. And a conservation easement is similar to that in that it creates, I'd like to say, covenants, codes, and restrictions for that particular piece of property to ensure its permanent protection with the overall goal and intention of protecting those conservation values. Again, the recreation, the historic, the scenic, the wildlife habitat. And so when you look at the process, we follow the national accreditation standards for conservation easements and land trusts. And the conservation easement is made up of what I like to call, again, the intentions. So you get to talk about why this piece of property is important. And then there are permitted uses. And it includes what you might want to accomplish on the property in the future. And really where the rubber meets the road is in the prohibited uses on the conservation easement, where basically you are identifying the things that you don't want to have happen. Utah Open Lands will identify the conservation values. We put together the baseline documentation, which is basically the mapping, looking at what the current condition of the property is. And in some instances, it includes some guidance for how restoration or improvements might take place. For example, on Bonanza Flat, we actually worked with the city and a trails organization to create the new Bloods Lake Trail, which actually is a much more sustainable trail to Bloods Lake than the erosion that was occurring from the last trail. And we've worked on a number of restoration as well as new trail development on Bonanza Flat that actually will create a greater sustainable trail system. We also review potential encumbrances that might be part of the title of the property. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we provide the enforcement. Next slide. And one of the reasons that Utah Open Lands does this is because we really want to ensure protection of these properties to the greatest extent that we can, knowing what tools we have today. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, as I like to say. What does this mean? Can the conservation easement be changed? Can the conservation easement be taken off of the property? Well, really, to answer those questions, you have to get into the document itself. But the bottom line is, if what you're trying to do is ensure the public trust of this property for the park, the recreational values, the habitat values that it already has, you can put all sorts of terms under that conservation easement to ensure that you are protecting the public trust. Will you be able to privately benefit a developer with that property? No, that's not what the conservation easement is designed to do. So if that were the intention, you'd have to carve that out ahead of time. But with respect to the conservation easement, there is a lot of flexibility. And at the end of the day, I feel it's important to help everyone understand that conservation easements can be condemned. However, it has to be for a higher public purpose than the public purpose for which it was originally protected. And one of the reasons that's important, especially when we work with government entities, is the power of condemnation obviously is within that government entity. Yes, we have fought condemnation on different properties, but I can tell you every single case has been for a private benefit that was not in the public interest. And that is why we won. If it were a higher public interest or if it were for the public benefit, that would not have occurred. Next slide. And so basically, I want to share just briefly the timeline that Utah Open Lands sees in terms of moving through this process. We've done this on a number of different properties. When we protected the Bridal Veil Falls piece and that did the conservation easement, that was a very, very tight time frame. We'd rather have a longer time frame and something more akin to some of the things we've done on places like Bonanza Flat, or even when we worked on the Cottonwood Heights Bonneville Shoreline Trail. Because part of what we think is really great as this process of putting the conservation easement together, the documents themselves, that's something obviously you get the attorneys involved, Utah Open Land staff is involved in drafting those and looking through the title and all of the sort of into the weeds, nitty gritty elements. But when you're really talking about how do you best want to protect this property, we think that public input is absolutely a wonderful thing to engage in this process, because that is what makes ultimately a good preservation tool from the conservation easement perspective. So the way that we would see this, we already have worked to put together a survey. We'd probably collect that information from folks and then do another survey as we get further down in terms of the different conservation restrictions, prohibitions, and then also obviously the permitted uses, to better understand how the public uses the property and what the public would like to see move forward, as well as obviously what is the vision of the leadership today and what is some of the historic context for this property as well. And so in going through that, as we've worked on the conservation easement, there are ample opportunities to draft what those plans are, to put down what those reserved rights will be, what the prohibited uses are going to be, and even to hold multiple open houses where the public can come take a look at visual mapping, take a look at some of the actual language and provide input. With all of that, basically the time frame that we would anticipate working through all of this would be to have a final recordable conservation easement document along with the baseline documentation somewhere by October 2021. With that, I'm going to end my presentation unless there's a specific thing somebody wants me to answer right now, and turn it back to the council.
Thanks, Wendy. So we've had kind of a summary of what a conservation easement does, what it is, how we get there. I guess a few thoughts that I had were, number one, a conservation easement isn't a cookie cutter approach. You don't have one framework to apply to every conservation easement. And what I heard here, and a welcome comment, is that we are capable of tailor making a conservation easement that provides for the protection of the property that we value, but also still allows for certain things to happen. For example, the maintenance and preservation of the city's assets, the hardware, like the cell tower, the water storage facility. We have a sewer line that goes through Lambert Park. We have the rodeo grounds. We have other things that we don't want to relinquish control over. And in fact, I think the conservation easement gives us the ability to write in control of those things while still preserving the open space for the recreational use of our community. To me, that's a great value because we lose nothing in the process. We guarantee a long-term asset for the community's use while we preserve our physical and financial assets. And so that's kind of my nutshell version of why we should do it, why we should move forward with the conservation easement, because it's a win-win and we can design it to make sure it's a win-win. If there are concerns that we have on any of the parameters, we can word it specifically to address the needs of the city. So with that, I'd welcome comment. Lon, do you have anything?
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear an explanation, the difference between a preservation easement and a conservation easement.
That is a great question, and it's something that we get asked from time to time. Essentially, if you look under the Utah Code 5718(1), that whole code talks about the conservation easement and the various different types of conservation easements. So it actually identifies that you can do basically an agricultural conservation easement, or you can do one just for historic uses. There's a group in Utah called Preservation Utah, and what they focus on actually is exactly that tool that you just talked about, which is more of a historic facade easement. So those are typically referred to, as you just mentioned, as preservation easements. They are more a tool that really deals with the actual protection of the facade. And actually, when you look at the federal code, those facade easements have some slightly different triggers. There are some new market tax credits and some other things that can be applied to when you're trying to preserve a historic facade on a building that then is going to be renovated for commercial use and that sort of thing. So typically the conservation easement can allow for different types: agriculture, recreation, scenic, or they can all be combined. Sometimes there are all of those values. And then the preservation easement typically is what was referred to or utilized in a straight historic facade preservation.
Thanks, Wendy. Vaughn, did you have anything else you'd like to address right now? Or
Not right now, we can go.
okay,
Go,
move on to
Todd.
Jessica.
Okay, can you just offer, you said it's an enforcement right so that the Utah Open Lands enforces whatever the city determines needs to be enforced. So would an example of that be when in the condemnation example that you spoke to, or can you give us an example of what that would look like?
Yes, so we don't like to be the police because we're obviously not the police. What our job in terms of enforcement is, you as a city council and as a city say, we want to protect the trails. We want to protect the scenic value. We want to protect all of these things. We've identified them in pictures and maps and documents in the baseline documentation. But then somebody comes and encroaches on it. So we have an example, for example, on the Galena-Soncani Preserve, where the adjacent developer actually encroached on the state property and built a wall. We actually had to go after that particular violation. And we've now cured that violation. Nationally, the courts are not looking fondly on someone who violates a conservation easement. In this particular instance, obviously, it was also a takings of the state property. So there's a number of things that come into that, but that is part of our enforcement. If many people are aware that a developer sued Utah County and named Utah Open Lands with respect to Bridal Veil Falls, because they wanted to be able to develop that property from a private perspective. So we were involved in defending the conservation easement. We are not going to go and, take the folks who are doing graffiti on the rocks to jail. That's not the kind of enforcement that Utah Open Lands does. However, we do get involved in working through some of those issues. And really what we found is doing a lot of education. For example, up on Bloods Lake, because it's a water source for the Girl Scout camp, dogs cannot be off leash and they cannot be in the lake. So we've actually embarked on an educational campaign. And I have somebody who's up there every weekend talking to people about why it is that this is the stipulation of keeping your dogs on a leash, that sort of thing. But our enforcement, we have education, and then the enforcement really is the defense of the terms of the conservation easement. Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, and let me just add, so could a potential scenario be, the poppies and the historic value that adds, that you could do some education around that, and maybe in the future have someone there during high poppy season to help us manage that area so that it is protected. And
yes, absolutely. And if I do say so, one of the reasons that I thought it was really important to start looking at the survey is a survey is also an educational tool. I think a lot of times people anticipate this, the open space is protected forever, and they may not know all of the different attributes. They may not understand a particular species or a historic value that's on there. So as we move through with the survey, that can be part of that educational process. But absolutely, we can be engaged in that. And we've also worked, for example, with the city of Park City and Cottonwood Heights and Salt Lake County, actually to go after grants from the governor's office of outdoor recreation. And in fact, we were just awarded $150,000 for renovations on Bridal Veil Falls Welcome Center.
okay, thank you.
That's it. Carla?
Oh, I was curious about, I'm sure you guys are doing all this pro bono, right? For free. What kind of fees are we looking at?
Definition of our organization,
Is it?
is pro bono.
So there's no fees involved in your involvement?
So one of the things that's obviously critical is my time is free drafting the conservation easement. I have a board of attorneys, which is a blessing. I'm gonna put it that way. I'm not gonna say any attorney jokes. They're great. They're awesome. But they do all of their work for free as well. In fact, one of them just put together a seminar that we did with the University of Utah. So all of that stuff does come to the city for free. What Utah Open Lands has to do, and we have to make sure we get it done, is to make sure that there is a stewardship endowment, if you will, for Lambert Park, so that we can defend it into the future. And most likely, we will talk to various different foundations to say, look, the city's trying to do this great thing. Will you help contribute to the stewardship fund? But that is something we would go out and solicit funding for. It would be tagged specifically to Lambert Park. It doesn't go to pay any of our general operational fees or for any of the work that's done on Lambert Park. It is for this ongoing defense and protection of that particular property.
Oh, if you could just say, I've got a couple more questions.
Yeah, sure.
You talked about that a conservation easement can be flexible, which is, I guess, counter to what I had learned. So how flexible can it be and what components can be flexible?
So,
Or are you talking about just in drafting it, that it's not just a cookie cutter?
yes, just in drafting it. And in fact, I think that's the important thing. Once we do this and once it's recorded, you have now bound Utah Open Lands to those terms, and those are not flexible. There is the ability to amend a conservation easement, but those are very specific in terms of the way that that gets tailored. So again, you can create the flexibility when you're doing the document. However, I will say there may come a point where you put so much flexibility in the document that it doesn't make sense for Utah Open Lands to even accept the conservation easement because it would be meaningless, in which case we would let you know and we'd say, that was fun and we'll see you later. But we wouldn't do that because that just 10 years from now, I can tell you, the people will want to know why it is that you didn't really permanently protect it.
Right.
So the goal, we have to follow through on the intention. And if we get to a place flexibility doesn't really protect that intention, then I don't think we should be wasting time talking about it. So that, I think that's a good clarifying point. Yes.
No, I agree. And then you talked that, that the conservation easement would be legally defensible, except for a higher public purpose. Are there any examples of that?
If
I'm just curious because, you talked about most of the cases that you work with has been for a personal purpose or personal advancement. Safety, have there been any cases where that has happened and and this, whatever?
So roads are a pretty typical example of condemnation that occurs. We got to have a road that goes from here to there. It would have to prove that there was a safety component, that there wasn't another alternative for the road, and that it wasn't actually creating a private benefit. Because I think that is one of the key issues. And we've actually had instances where there's been a proposed road. In fact, recently there was one that was proposed on the High Ranch. It would have completely eliminated the city's plan in terms of recreation, alternative transportation, because it would have wiped out that particular pedestrian trail. And in addition to that, we did our own studies and it actually did not solve any of the transportation issues. So I'm not saying it's an easy, is there a higher public purpose? But I think that the rigor of proving that is key. And I know sometimes people say, oh, well, but wait, if we want to change our minds in the future, we want to be able to do it. Nope, you're going to have to go through the process. Yes, we are going to defend the conservation easement. Yes, we are going to look for holes and whether or not it really is a higher public purpose, because our job is to protect the public trust. Our job is to protect and defend the easement that you gave to us. So it's not easy. It can be done. And that's what we've had to defend against.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Jason?
Just a couple of questions. So we talked about a stewardship endowment. Does that have to be created and established before conservation easement can?
We
into effect?
prefer that it gets established and created prior to.
And that's through private funds.
That's how we typically do it. Yes.
How much?
But you are welcome to contribute if you would like, for sure.
How much typically is needed for that to happen?
It depends on the particular property, which I know who wants to hear. It can range from $6,500 to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the particular property.
Okay. Explain-
Total, and that's a one-time.
So explain this. I've heard this from a couple of residents, but obviously we have a conservation easement. We've had conservation easements here in Alpine, correct? The PAC property was a conservation easement. Those developers were able to obviously reap tremendous tax credits by doing that.
Okay.
What happens in a scenario like this with relationship to tax credits? Does anyone benefit from those? Having you come in and set this up?
So not sure about the conservation easements here, and I'm not gonna necessarily talk on those. They're not actually tax credits because that is not available here in the state of Utah. There are only tax credits available in Colorado, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and I think 1 or 2 other states. But there is a federal tax deduction, which is what most developers take. And at this point, it is a very generous tax deduction, but it's meant for private pieces of property. So because this is a public piece of property, it's, I have never heard of a case where that is then spread out towards the community. The financial gain in protecting a piece of property forever is that, as you'll see from any place from Central Park in New York to the Swanner Nature Preserve up in Park City, the surrounding market value is always going to be higher because it's desirable to live next to these particular places. And in fact, during the downturn in 2008 and 2009, those communities that had significant open space did not see as much of a downturn as other places. But there's not a tax deductible gift because it's already a public piece of property. So I don't know. I mean, I can research that a little bit more, but I'm not aware of any way that that would be possible on this particular property because it's already publicly owned. The tax deduction is given for doing something that is considered a public benefit, which I'm assuming those other transactions were private that conferred a public benefit.
So, and again, I apologize. It's more a curiosity question on how this whole process works. But one resident said, you know, kind of, I don't know the laws or anything, but why don't you sell it to a private individual and then have them do the tax conservation and city can benefit from the sale, the contract would, I know I see, but I'm just wondering, have you heard of anything like that happening before?
So the issue there is something that's known in the federal code as quid pro quo. And the issue there would be that it would be really kind of hard to pass a smell test on something like that. In other words, you sold it to this person with the anticipation that it was going to be restricted. If you didn't sell it to the individual, the anticipation that it was going to be restricted, then there's always the possibility that they could just develop it, right?
Sure.
Because you can't have anything in the contract. You can't have anything that's going to alert or create that quid pro quo sort of situation. So I can say pretty unequivocally, I don't know that that would, I know that wouldn't pass muster with the IRS. And I haven't ever heard of that happening. You know, there are ways to, you know, generate a fund for the protection of Lambert Park that comes back into the city, but that's going back to kind of your, you know, your taxpayers and asking them to help you protect the land that you have as open space. So I don't know of any situation where that would work. And I know under the federal tax code, you wouldn't be able to get a deduction for that because it would be considered a quid pro quo.
Because obviously private people do it. They sell their property to someone else. And then they do the conservation easement and then they may sell it right after that to someone else. They've taken the tax benefit, but you're saying this one's different because it's a public.
So I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody, but I can tell you right now that one of the blacklisted transactions the IRS is going after is what they call a syndicated deal. And that is where they have sold off partnerships in a piece of property to enable a tax deduction that's greater than the price of the property that they purchased it for. And it is a big no-no. And so I'm just saying that there may have been things like that have happened. I don't know that there's still something that can actually happen. And in this particular instance, I don't see that that would happen in a legitimate conservation easement transaction. You have an individual, oftentimes a farmer or a rancher, or someone who's owned the land for a long amount of time, and they decide that they want to leave a legacy for the community because ultimately they love their land. And so they come to an organization like Utah Open Lands, and they look to us to donate a conservation easement. In some instances, they can work with a federal program, the Farmland Protection Program or the Agricultural Land Easement Program. Those sorts of things can provide some cash, but basically there is 100% tax deductible value for them. In other words, they can take 100% of their adjusted gross income for 16 years against the value of the conservation easement gift that they make. If it's not a farmer or rancher, an individual can take 50% their adjusted gross income. But the caveat has to be that it has to pass the conservation purposes test under 170H, and that the appraisal has to be within the regulations outlined by the federal guidelines as well.
Great. I mean, you obviously know so much, appreciate it. I've learned a ton. I guess last question is your organization, is it a government agency? Is it a for-profit, nonprofit? Who, what type of structure is that?
So we are a 501c3 public charity. We are a nonprofit organization. This is not an asset for the organization. In fact, all conservation easements are liabilities, much to the chagrin of my board, but they are liabilities for our organization because we are obligated to defend them. We also carry what we call terra firma insurance. Terra firma insurance is actually nationwide insurance specific to the protection of conservation easements that provides us with a certain amount of money should we come up against having to defend these conservation easements against encroachment or that sort of thing. And then in addition to that, we also have a stewardship fund, which we would put money aside again for Lambert Park. We do that for every single property. We're not asking something different on this particular property than what we would do on any property, public or private, for all of those. But that is how we defend, and that's basically how the organization works. We have about 5 staff members, and I've been with the organization for 30 years. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. Don't know what else I can tell you about it. Does that answer most of the questions?
Yep.
We're not a state entity, but again, there are a lot of different laws, and we have worked with the state attorney general in enforcing conservation easements throughout the state.
What if the Utah Open Lands dissolved? What happens to the conservation easement contracts, et cetera?
That is something that we obviously hope will never happen, but you absolutely have to anticipate that. And so there's actually a provision within the conservation easement document called the transferee clause, where basically it talks about the fact that it would have to go to a like entity. And those entities that actually can hold conservation easements include the Division of Wildlife Resources or another charitable organization like Utah Open Lands. It's obviously a good question because yes, although we've been around for 30 years, this is something that we're needing to enforce for a long time, right? So that is something that is actually in the document itself. And that is the reason that we actually identify that we've put together the stewardship fund for all of these different properties, because in the event of that transfer, obviously the stewardship for this particular property would go to the new entity that would have to be in charge of enforcing the conservation easement. But that is something we put in the document, even though we don't anticipate that ever happening.
A couple more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, you've been very helpful in letting us know that you don't charge anything, but there are costs involved in this, I'm sure. So what are the costs? Appraisals, our attorneys' costs, us. I'd like to know all the even the hidden costs that there might be.
Right.
And then we do have this stewardship endowment that we would need to fund, and let's talk costs.
I can give a partial answer to that, and I'd like Wendy to address it as well. Steve Doxey, and I neglected to introduce Steve Doxey at the beginning of the meeting. Steve is here from our firm, our law firm that represents the city. And Steve is here tonight because he has been involved in a number of conservation easement discussions and the legal action that follows. Steve and I had a conversation earlier today, and he invited me, encouraged me to have us work more through someone like Wendy, who can get us to where we really have a good document before he gets involved. So we save money by doing that. At some point, Steve and Craig and Hiram may become involved, but that will be to kind of finish off the process. So it minimizes our billable hours. So, and Wendy, feel free to cover the rest of that.
Yeah, one of the things I think that your question suggests, and I think it's really important, is that ultimately we are a partner. Utah Open Lands is a partner in this, but we absolutely encourage people to be represented by their own legal counsel. which is appropriate here. We do have foremost experts on the board. In fact, Nancy McLaughlin, who just put together the seminar Trying Times, she's on our board. She works through these conservation easements. That seminar brought together Steve Small, who actually wrote the regs for conservation easements when he was with the IRS in the 80s. We had someone from the Chief's Counsel of the IRS. We had an appraiser with the Treasury Department in Colorado. So we do have a vast amount of expertise, and our goal is to help you accomplish the public benefit that you are intending to do with this conservation easement. So we're happy to take on the lion's share of the burden of drafting the conservation easement and kind of keeping that to a minimum when it comes to your attorney. But absolutely, you're going to have some billable hours when it comes to them reviewing the documents that we've worked on. And I think obviously what I've seen just here tonight is that you as a council have a vast amount of knowledge, expertise, and wisdom when it comes to these sorts of things. And so crafting that into the document, working closely with you, I think we can get the document really far along. As far as an appraisal, I'm not sure I understand why you would want to do an appraisal. There's not a tax deduction that you would necessarily be taking. And unless you need to figure out what the asset is that's on your books already, I don't know that we would need to engage an appraiser on that. If you did feel that you needed to do a conservation easement appraisal, those typically run about $6,500. Again, I'm not sure if that's something you would need to do. And then I think the other element to it would be understanding what the title is on the property. And that's something that we could look at. I'm sure you guys already know what it is that you own. So I don't know how much of an issue that would be. I don't anticipate that we would be requiring title insurance. And then the only other issue would be whether or not the property has been surveyed. And that might be a cost. I don't know if you've already surveyed it. Sometimes what communities will do is they'll actually just survey the boundaries that they're most concerned about encroachments on. But that, I mean, those survey costs can range from a couple $100 to thousands of dollars. It just depends on what you'd want to do. It's not necessarily a requirement. There are other ways to approach that as well.
Shane, didn't we do an assessment, not an assessment, but didn't we have it surveyed about 6 years ago?
The Lambert Park as a whole, to my knowledge, has not been surveyed.
Maybe it was just that eastern or western border.
There's some, newer subdivisions that surround the perimeter of it,
Yeah.
that some of those areas would have been surveyed by the other side of the property line, but I don't believe we have done a survey.
Okay. Thank you, Jessica, for reminding me. We have Greg Gordon online joining this meeting. Greg, would you like to chime in with any questions or points of clarification?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, I definitely believe, Lambert Park should be protected and preserved, right? It's just sort of a matter of how we structure that. I mentioned that in part because I've had at least, half a dozen residents ask me if the city's considering developing Lambert Park, into housing or something. And so I think it's quite the opposite here. I guess that's the nature of rumor. But anyway, appreciate you being here, Wendy. I had just a few questions. I know Park City has an extensive open land structure and trail system. And I think even recently acquired some flat land kind of down by the junction or the entry to the city. Are they doing that? Do you know? Is that a preservation easement? Are they using some other structure? Or are there? Do you know how they're doing it in say Park City? Is that through you or other methods with pros and cons?
Yeah, actually, I do know about that. That particular piece of property is called Clark Ranch.
Right.
It's on the entry corridor there at the junction of Highway 40 and 248, which enters into the city. It's approximately 340 acres. And I know this because Utah Open Lands is the entity that they're working with to put a conservation easement on that property. There's about 10 acres of that ground that actually they have, from the very beginning of that purchase, identified that they might need to put a fire station on, or that they might need to use for some other use. So that 10 acres is actually not going to be placed under the conservation easement, but that was something that was part of the public process when they actually acquired that property. And then we went through a citizens advisory board to develop a management plan, conservation easement, the baseline. That has not been placed on the property yet because they're still trying to figure out if they actually really need that 10 acres. One of the other elements to what Park City has done in general in terms of conservation easements is that actually there was a survey that was done back in the late 90s in Park City to determine what people wanted to do with respect to open space. And one of the things that came out of that survey is that the community felt that the best way to ensure these protections beyond providing funds through an open space bond was to ensure that they were placed under a conservation easement with a third party. So since that time, all of the open space that Park City has acquired, for the most part, there are a couple of things with the ski resorts that were ski runs, but has been placed under a third-party conservation easement, either with Utah Open Lands or the Summit Land Conservancy.
Awesome, thank you. And another question, I know you had a semi-recent preservation of the Bonneville Shoreline Trail near the Cottonwoods, right? And you know, like 2 days later, UDOT showed up, it sounds like, and said they had a, you know, future use. Now, you know, clearly I don't think we envision a train or gondola, you know, coming through Lambert Park. In fact, I think that, you know, very unlikely, right, that ever be a threat, but I think it's, you know, wise to prevent and protect when we can. You know, but I guess that raises you know, a question, you know, what's the sort of flexibility or latitude for transportation, you know, type things, or new trails? Let's say we just wanted to add a water fountain, maybe fences around it, you know, continue to allow dogs even off leash and so on. You know, what does that look like within a conservation easement? Is that all custom or you know, what you know, what restrictions may be there?
That is custom, and you're bringing out all the skeletons there in the closet. Let me talk a little bit about the Cottonwood Heights Bonneville Shoreline Trail project, because I think it's a great example of why conservation easements are so significant. Unfortunately, sometimes there's perception that the path of least resistance might be to utilize the open space for something that might end up being, at the end of the day, something that should really be paid for by a private interest. In this particular instance, UDOT went through the entire summer with a public survey as to what transportation needs were needed in Little Cottonwood Canyon, and the gondola nor the train on this particular piece of property was ever an option until the Lakai parcel was purchased by developers. And that is when the gondola piece came about. As it turns out, that alternative going through the open space Cottonwood Heights Bonneville Shoreline Trail has been completely taken off the table because it forced some real critical thinking about whether or not they were working in the public's best interest or whether there was a potential private interest, and really what was the best solution. So that alternative is no longer a part of the plans for transportation corridors, even though a gondola is still a plan for the transportation corridor up Little Cottonwood Canyon. So with that said, I think that's a great reason that a conservation easement is a good defense, but you are absolutely right, Craig. If you want to put a water fountain, or if you even want to allow for a roadway, those are things that can be considered prior to placing the conservation easement on the property. That's why there's a fair amount of visioning that gets done in a conservation easement. This is really a legacy piece. And I think that's the important way to look at it. I'll be really blunt. I have to say that what locks in the fate of the land more so than anything else is the moment you've concreted it. It's never going to be a farm field again. It's never going to be an open space again. Actually, with a conservation easement, if there's really that need in the future, there are ways that it can get done, provided it is in the public interest and part of the public trust.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and then last question I had was kind of around maintenance and say any upgrades and so on. I guess that all still remains because it's city property, and within, I guess, the terms, the city would still maintain it. Or perform any, say, upgrades or updates. The one thought that kind of came to mind is, we've had a couple fires in the area. Let's say we had a terrible fire and it caused a lot of damage and so on, and there could be a mudslide or something. I guess that still remains the city's right, I guess, to restore, and maintain. It is, potentially even the city's responsibility. If it sort of got, cleared out in a fire, or does Utah Open Lands sort of have any sort of rights and responsibilities in terms of maintenance, upgrades, restoration, and that type of thing?
We do not end up taking on the obligations of ownership, because you guys would continue to own that property. We have those obligations on land that we own in fee, even when there's another conservation easement holder. As far as fire mitigation, or maybe let's call them acts of nature or acts of God or force majeure, that is actually a clause that is placed in the conservation easement that acknowledges that things out of our control may happen. And there may be things that the city has to do that you wouldn't typically allow for in a conservation easement, but in order to stop the fire or to deal with the landslide or any of those sorts of issues, you have to do in an emergency situation. It's already something that's pretty much contemplated, but obviously there's some flexibility that we could add to it as well. And then the other part of it is, with all of our partners, again, Park City, we worked with them to achieve a $150,000 grant from the governor's office. We got some other private donors involved to help put in the trailhead and the trail system up on Bonanza Flat. We've just done that recently with Bridalveil Falls with the $150,000 for some of the improvements and maintenance that needs to happen there. We like to see ourselves as a silent partner, but a good partner, and one that can actually help in some of those instances, seek out other sources of funding, because there are foundations and donors that look at this and realize that once the community has made the commitment to permanently protect these places as open space, that those necessary maintenance things are things that come along and they want to help. And sometimes we can be a conduit to help do that in a partnership role, but we don't assume that obligation of ownership.
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy.
I do have to say, you guys have done a great job with the Bonanza Flat project. It's
Well,
been
we have
an
our
issue
critics.
years with parking up at the top at Parley's, and it's so much more of an elegant and life-sustaining project. Yeah, you guys did a great job.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and we have Will Jones in the room. He's the head of our Trails Committee. And so to Greg's point, Will has been terrific at coordinating with the local mountain bike teams to do work on our trails, and that would continue, right? So under the parameters of what you just described, we would still do the trail improvements, things like that. We'd get assistance if we needed it, if you're capable of providing it. But we are still the primary responsible party for the maintenance and upkeep.
Yeah, and we love volunteers. Having a group like that is just, that's just amazing. That's fantastic. Good job, Will. We love that. That is awesome, because you need that. But yeah, we've even gone out and gotten ISM grants to remove invasive species. Now, it's something that obviously the city is doing and maintaining, so that money basically just goes to you guys, although we've done volunteer weed pulls, and I've made my fair share of garlic mustard pesto.
I have just a couple of quick questions for you, Wendy. Are the conservation easements that you see typically indefinite, or do you see varying terms in terms of time?
There is a thing called a term limited easement. Utah Open Lands has not done a term limited easement at this time. And the reason for that is several fold. You talked about costs and putting this together. We're trying to save you those costs. But if you're going to put that kind of time and energy and cost into doing it, there are actually studies nationwide that show that the monetary benefit of a term limited easement diminishes dramatically, and it's sometimes not even worth doing, because the issues that you don't want to wrestle with today that would lead you to do a term limited easement are the same issues that are going to be there 10, 15, 20, 30 years out there. You are best to do the visioning to really understand what is the legacy you want to leave, or if you feel like you want to just leave it and take the risk, that is obviously an option as well. I'm not saying that our organization wouldn't consider a term limited easement, but with the fact that you're a public entity, the issues of powers of condemnation and the amount of flexibility we could build into it, I would hope we would come to a place where we create the legacy that didn't need that, because we'd done the kind of thinking that needed to happen and recognize that the unknowables were also accounted for in the conservation easement or in the law itself.
Great. And to that point, today, for example, if you look at the park today, I would say that the vast majority of the people up there are, on certain days especially, mountain bikers. And they didn't exist 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But we've seen an evolution of the park usage. We have horseback riders, we have joggers, trail runners, hikers, a lot of people on foot, and then we have people on mountain bikes. That has really come up in the last 5 to 7 years since the high schools started their programs. I've been mountain biking up there for 20 years and it's been great, but I've noticed a lot of pressure on the trails. So I guess my question is, to your point a minute ago about being visionary about the future, how do we accommodate changing multiple use? Because today there's a definite majority that are using it for mountain biking, but there are still a lot of hikers and still a lot of horseback people, and we have other things, but something may come along down the road that we haven't even seen yet, and that creates another demand on the park. So how do we accommodate that long term without seeing it today?
Well, I confess that I went mountain biking on Lambert Park and had a great day. It's awesome. It's really, really great. And the technology that is now available with mountain bikes, certainly from when I first started mountain biking, is just dramatic, and it allows people to go a lot of different places. The short answer to your question is I would suggest within the conservation easement, we identify a trails map and a trails plan, and maybe even the ability to create a management plan in the future that had the parameters of identifying user groups, identifying the recreational experience, identifying recreational user group conflicts, because those exist.
Yeah.
I can tell you right now, you will see them, hikers, mountain bikers, horseback riders. I do all of those things. I have a horse, mountain bike, and I hike. They don't always work together. And then you need to consider, what is the recreational experience for those different user groups? When I was out there, for example, I saw a lot of young kids out mountain biking. I saw some couples hiking, and then I saw a family, and they were using what seemed to be a trail that was wider that not many mountain bikers would want to be on. And they even said, "Which way are you going?" And I said, "No, you tell me," because it was clear that they wanted to have an uninterrupted hike. So those things will all come up. And what we suggest is, and what we've done, for example, on Bonanza Flat, is we've actually created a management plan. That takes longer, and that's not going to happen by October. I'm just going to put that out there. But you can create a management plan after it's done that then gets approved and ratified by the city council. And in the Bonanza Flat conservation easement, any changes to that management plan have to go before the city council every 5 years if there is a change that is wanted. And there is a required public hearing. In the Bridal Veil Falls, some of the permitted uses have to go through at least 3 public hearings. So you can put some caveats in there that allow you to adapt to what you see as changing uses in the park, improvements, changing technologies, and then you can have the opportunity for the public to weigh in before that actually takes place. That would be my initial recommendation.
Okay, I think that's good advice. One of the things I'm thinking about on that line is, 5 years ago, if we had done this, we probably wouldn't even consider the impact of e-bikes. And today e-bikes are becoming a very large portion of the riders out there, a large segment. And so they have certain impact on the trails. They have certain impact on those riding the trails. And so something like that, I would want to be able to adjust for down the road if something like that pops up, so that we have an opportunity to mitigate any of the negatives that might come with it. Okay, thank you for that. Can you think of any reason why we wouldn't want a conservation easement up there?
Well, this obviously puts me in the awkward
Yeah.
position. So let me think about that for a second. I think that one of the things that's key is you have to feel comfortable with the partner that you're working with, i.e. Utah Open Lands. And that, I think, is an important element of having these conversations back and forth, because at the end of the day, you want to know whether or not Utah Open Lands can be a trusted partner that's going to help you do the right things in the park, or are we going to constantly be on your back and say, no, don't do this, and have the thumbs down on you? That's definitely part of it. I think the other element to it is there's obviously always the question of why do we even need to do this? It's a public open space. It has been a public open space. So why add the layer of protection? And actually, again, I'm going to be biased, so I may not be the best person to answer that. But I have watched a lot of places that people loved dearly that they thought were protected, that in a rash moment with a bad decision and certain people who were put in a leadership position who had other motivations, that got torpedoed. It was gone. And really the other reason of why to do it now is kind of why not? What are we afraid of in terms of doing that visioning and that legacy piece for the community and involving the community and ensuring that we have done what we can to protect that property in perpetuity? If we get down the road and you decide that you really don't like the sound of my voice, you can always say, nuh-uh, we're not doing this. And we walk away and it's okay. You know, I'll still come to city council meetings. No, it just, that is something that's part of this process. So other than that, you know, as I've said, you can put parameters in there that really allow for the right kind of flexibility in the future with future city councils, and deter the wrong ideas.
Thank you, Wendy. And to that point, we have currently Lambert Park is protected under an ordinance that requires a supermajority vote. 4 out of the 5 council members would vote to change or alter the use of the park or any transaction that might occur for the park. It's my point of view that that's been great up until now. But as we progress through the build out of Alpine, I think there will be increasing pressures, and maybe not today, maybe not next year, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we can't predict what kind of circumstances may be presented. You know, the economy could crash and cities could be struggling for money again, like they did in 2008. And fortunately, at that time, we were in great financial shape. We didn't have to look at alternatives like selling off our land to support our city, but that time could come. I mean, we don't know what the future holds. Another pandemic, other circumstances that would change slightly, and it just takes a slight change, the way we look at the park, the way we look at our land assets within the city. And so what I'd like to do is make sure that that doesn't happen to certain things. You know, we do want to maintain control of our assets. We want to create a situation where the city has trusts its current leadership to be stewards of our properties and our assets. But at some point, do we want to risk that a 4 out of 5 majority would be willing to vote in a different direction because it felt like it had to, or because it felt like it would be more profitable to do so if priorities change? Today, we have an increasing demand for public recreation. I mean, it has really increased, as Wendy pointed out, with COVID. You know, when I bike in Lambert now, I'm really competing for space. And so, you know, we want to make sure that the community continues to benefit from natural open spaces, that we continue to have the opportunity to decompress at the end of a busy workday, or to get our minds off of topics that might be pressuring us otherwise, and to be able to disappear up into the woods and have a good recovery time and then go back home. In my experience, and including this morning, I often stop and talk to people along the way when I'm in Alpine or in the park and ask where they're from. And I ran into people today, about 200 people from American Fork on the mountain bike team, and then several people from Highland, some from Cedar Hills, and several from Alpine. And what that tells me is that we have a wonderful thing here in Alpine that is not only enjoyed by our own citizens, our own community, but from people in the surrounding area. And those aren't things you let go of, and those are not things you leave to chance down the road. Again, I'm certain that everybody here wants to protect Lambert Park right now. My concern is what type of priority changes will we see down the road? What kind of pressures economically will we see that could change that slightly enough to cause us to lose Lambert Park, or to see it change in ways that we wouldn't want to see today? So With that, Steve, would you like to discuss any of your past experience or some of the things maybe we haven't considered tonight?
Well, thanks, Mayor. I think Wendy has addressed in pretty good detail the ins and outs of a conservation easement. So I appreciate her knowledge and her experience. I guess I would give, if anything, you don't have to be tied to Utah Open Lands. I was the one who recommended Utah Open Lands to the city because of the experience that they have, the people they have on their board. I know a number of their board members and used to work with a number of them. I don't know if there are any questions that you might have for me other than what Wendy's already talked about. As she said, a conservation easement is property ownership is a bundle of rights. And the city, if you do enter into a conservation easement, would be giving up some of those valuable rights. And you could do that in perpetuity. Most people do that in perpetuity, but it could be done with other limits, as we talked about. There are termination triggers you could write into the contract. It's really basically a contract, but it gets recorded. So it applies to any successors in interest on either side. And there's just a lot of flexibility under the Utah statute governing conservation easements. So my suggestion would be, if you decide to go down this path, that you thoroughly engage the community and get their input, not just through surveys, but through open houses and through charrettes or other forums where people are going to be able to give their input as to what they value about this property. At the same time, Utah Open Lands, if they're selected as your partner, will do a survey, a backup document that would be part of the conservation easement itself. It would identify critical species and critical uses. And, you know, if there's some things that you want to exempt out of the easement, either a segment of property or particular features, you can put that in. You can change the scope of the easement. You can't change it, but you can tailor the scope of the easement to what the community desires. So if this is the direction you want to go, I think we have some flexibility. I think you just ought to thoroughly solicit community input and make the best decision you can at this time, because it is difficult. You know, some people have said, I talked to the attorney who was handling Bridal Veil Falls for the county, and he said, well, conservation easement means that the current leadership doesn't trust future leadership. And maybe that's too simple, but it also, as Wendy's described, it also could be a legacy for the community if that's what the community wants.
Yeah, thank you. And just so we're clear, this is the first of many steps in the process. If we choose to move forward as a council, we will have a self-imposed requirement to have public hearings. So the public will be invited strictly for the purpose of giving us your feedback live. There will be more surveys, there will be questionnaires and other ways of gathering public opinion. I do think that's a very important part of this process. And for me, it feels like the public has pushed us in this direction anyway. I mean, the several conversations that I have on a regular basis have just all pushed in this direction. But we have, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to hear from the public.
Mayor, I'd like to hear some of the historic context of the property.
Yeah.
As was mentioned, Wendy mentioned that in part of her presentation, the historic context of the property, because I've heard from previous council people, older that are still alive, that seem to think that there was some verbiage in it, even back when they purchased the property, that there were certain things that could not be done based on how it was purchased and et cetera. So I'd like to see some of the historic context of it, along with the concern of, so that we can see that we're already maybe protect it enough. I know we have a supermajority thing. If you don't feel that's tight enough, maybe there is still some things that have protected us. I don't know that the problems that are coming up are more than just simply trying to take care of the overuse and abuse of the property currently. There's, like you were saying, a lot of activity up there, and we're going to have to gain some kind of control, whether you do a conservation easement or not,
Right.
on overuse and abuse of the property. And so we need to get a handle on that aspect of Lambert Park.
Okay, and so to address your question about historical perspective, in 1946, the first piece of Lambert Park, which is essentially half of it, if you took a line and drew it right along the center of the park, along that horseshoe, in 1946 was the first acquisition. And I believe Shane, was it $10,000 that was paid in exchange for that?
Yeah, I haven't found a lot of information.
Mike?
I've read one place where it was 9,000. I've read a place where it was 10,000. I haven't found a lot of detailed information.
Yeah. But $10,1946 is a pretty big chunk of money.
Yeah.
At that time. When I think the average home was about $2,000 at the time. So we got that first chunk in 1946, which is roughly half of the 255 or 235 acres, 255, right? And then the lower half was acquired in 1957. So and again, we don't have a lot of clarity on exactly what the original purchase was intended for, what the purpose of the property was.
Mayor, may I just suggest?
Yes, sir.
If you go down this path, you should order a preliminary title report that would pull up any recorded documents. I think that's what
Oh, yeah.
Wendy was talking about, so that we see the status of the title. There may be a deed restriction in there that we're just not even aware of.
Good point.
And so that would inform our decision about the history of the property.
Okay. How hard would it be to get that started now? That deed report?
You can order, yeah, we could order one.
Why don't we do that so we have clarity on that before we move any further?
Yeah.
Were there other things that you wanted to discuss, Lon? I forgot what the other points were.
Real quick. No, that's good.
Okay. Greg, I can't see if you're raising your hand or not. I have a feeling that's because you're in a swimming suit. Do you have anything to add?
No, not anymore. No, I covered everything. Thanks so much. I thought Lon's point was good on how we control and have a means to kind of control some of the overuse in some cases, right? Kind of poppy season or other times. But yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Anything? Jason?
Just to, I think to clarify on Lon's question about ongoing costs, it sounds like there are no ongoing costs once the stewardship endowment's created and the easement, or not the easement, conservation easement is put in place. So that's what I basically got out of it. There's no ongoing costs.
That is correct.
Okay,
I
good.
mean, other than, the overuse issue. That's
Yeah,
ongoing.
that's going to
Yeah.
be something we need to address in perpetuity as well. I mean, we've got to take care of our property,
Right.
in one way or another, either. So,
True.
okay.
Yeah.
So,
Did you-
Just a point on that. Right now, we, as the city, rely heavily on volunteers for maintenance of the trails.
Right.
Because we don't have the staff right now to go out and maintain trails. If there's, a couple times a year, there's a work day and Will says, hey, we need 2 loads of dirt and mini-X for half a day or something like that. We get out there and work with that. But on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis, we don't have the staff currently to go out and do those things. So if the volunteer help ever falls back and the use is still there will be that need.
Yeah,
So
okay.
Mayor, I have one more question, if that's all right, for our attorney Doxy, maybe. I was just thinking just now, with this conservation easement, if it's put in place and the outline is there for what it's, the restrictions that are on it, for example, would that affect developments that may go in around it in the county? What I mean by that is, if in your conservation easement, there's been talk about taking a road from that area and putting it up on what's the name of that? Bald Mountain Drive. They've talked about, there's lots of different discussions we've had on roads, but if we said in this particular thing, we're not changing our road map, our road map that is right now, would that affect, for example, if someone were to go to county and say, you can't just use this as your other access. Does that affect developments in the future by doing a conservation easements with those restrictions in it?
I'm going to let Wendy address that.
The answer to that is, let's kind of just, let me identify the question a little bit more. So you have a developer that moves in and he's in the county and there's a requirement for a secondary access or egress. And he doesn't have that ability within his development. If he develops, she develops, they develop the greatest extent of development. But if they put a road through Lambert Park, they could have their secondary egress and ingress. If we said there are no roads that go through Lambert Park, no, you couldn't do that. What is the effect for the developer? Well, the issue there is, again, a private benefit. I mean, I hate to say it, but if you buy a piece of property and you didn't buy water rights, you don't get to come and say, you owe me this. You have to find another means to doing that. Another example that might not be as harsh as a road is, what about utilities? Utilities could have a huge impact connecting to sewer or water or those sorts of things. If there's an existing sewer line or water line through the property, and then absolutely, that is an existing encumbrance on the title of the property. And that was what we call an encumbrance of record. That would be identified through doing the title search on the property, that we'd be able to identify. There again, if it doesn't exist, but it's cheaper for the developer to be able to develop through the property and put in that kind of utility. And it's not allowed for in the conservation easement because there isn't a utility corridor. The community would have to identify whether that's a private benefit or a public benefit, and whether or not that would be something they'd want to condemn through the property. So, I mean, there are ways to go about it, but does it affect development? I think that's a tough question from my perspective. I see it differently. No, it doesn't affect development at all, because we're not talking about private property that somebody owns. But does it affect development in that they can't use the public asset for their private development? Yeah. Does that make sense?
I'm just thinking, I mean, I'm taking this particular case and obviously we have area around us that can be annexed into Alpine. If there's a conservation easement and it says, this is the rules for the conservation easement, this is we're following the street map, and this is the street that's we allowed in there, and we're going to have trails going across it. It is what it is. So if you want to do your developments, you have to work within our existing, that's in the conservation easement. Those individuals would have to, that are annexing, would have to take, they couldn't use that as part of their development plan.
No, they don't get credit for it. Like, they can't use your open space as their open space credit. They can't. And in fact, I would think we'd want to make sure that it was clear in the conservation easement that in the event that there was a road or a utility that they could hook onto, that the costs and even the value or asset that they would be receiving from the community, even if it was allowed, right? Yes, we're going to allow this connection. Yes, it's allowed for in the conservation easement, but it doesn't come for free, for example. In other words, they can't use it as a way to say, so I get more density or I get this added benefit. I think you would want to put parameters in there to identify that. So if it is in the conservation easement plan, and yes, they can come through there, they can't take the public's property. They'd still have to pay maybe a use fee or something. I don't know. There are a lot of different issues. Would it prevent annexation of those properties? No, because it's just part of the overall and it's your property and you still get to utilize it from an annexation. So you could definitely annex those developments, but they don't get credit for
And
what.
I'm just wondering if there's a benefit, meaning in the case those come to the city for annexation, it's already been established kind of through this conservation easement, what the plan is there. So they have to work around what we're doing and what we've agreed to do as a city, as opposed to coming to us to say, you know what, we need to have this, you know. It puts us on our back heels, you know, to the point that Greg was making. We don't have a problem right now, but are we going to have a problem a couple years from now?
Well, there are two different ways that I think people look at this, and I'll give you definitely my biased position because of what I see from a public trust perspective. I've seen various different public easements in Salt Lake City, for example, and because there's nobody there to say no, and there's no third party, those just basically get taken over by private interests without the public having been compensated. And sometimes we have actually worked with various different agencies who don't want to be put in the position that a developer comes in and says, I want to utilize this asset, which is exactly what happened in that legislative example that I gave you, for this private gain. He had no access. Come to find out, yeah, I had to pay a lot more, but he was able to get the access that he needed without using the public asset as a private gain. So from that perspective, it helps. Now I can see the other side of the argument is, well, then we can't help the developers because we've already set this aside. And that would be true. You can't go then take this asset and help the developer that wants to do it because you've already set it aside. So I see both sides to it. I guess, you know, see it differently.
I think,
So what I
Go ahead,
would
Steve.
just say is I think that's something you need to weigh because you're trying to envision 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. What are the needs of the city? How big are we going to be? Do we need, you know, is that land going to be available to the city for property tax purposes? And those are just considerations, I think, council member, you have to take into consideration as you're making the decisions. As I suggested to the mayor some months ago that perhaps there are just some development critical areas of the park that you want to put under a conservation easement. Maybe there are some parts that you don't care about as much. There are all of those things that you need to weigh on the front end if you're going to be turning it over to a third party.
yeah, I think those are part of the important part of the conversation that we're going to have in the next, you know, few months, I guess. Steve, you've indicated that there are some omissions we might want to look at. And, you know, an example of that might be the rodeo grounds. You know, we may look at it and say, well, we want this conservation easement to protect the natural open space, but as far as the developed open space or semi-developed, which would be the rodeo grounds, you know, that we're going to look at that differently, and it'll still be protected under our current rules and guidelines, but it won't be included as part of the conservation easement. It's my feeling that we should be protecting the entire open space, unimproved open space, so that we can maintain that quality of the environment there. And I think that's really what this all boils down to. Alpine has a very unique lifestyle, a quality of life that we get to enjoy that I don't think any of us wants to see that go away. We do, I think some of us want to make it more foolproof so that it can't be in jeopardy down the road. And I think that's what this conversation is about. Okay, I think unless anybody on council has anything else to say, what I'd like to do is open it up to maybe a maximum of 20 minutes of public input, because we want to hear what you're thinking out there. And hopefully this has been a valuable work session for you, maybe clarified a few things that you weren't sure of coming in. And so if you do have questions or comments that you'd still like to ask, please come forward. And when you do so, please take a maximum of 2 minutes for your comments, and we'll allow 20 minutes total of public comment. And when you do come forward, please state your name and address, and then tell us what's on your mind on this topic. One more item I'd like to cover before we get into public comment. Again, to reiterate, the purpose of this meeting is to really understand more clearly what a conservation easement is what steps are necessary and what the ramifications are. We could get really deep into the weeds if we wanted to about what should be done with certain trails, what should be done with certain types of use and things like that. Just know that you will have opportunities to voice your opinions about those in the future. But I think right now we'd like to stick to the general purpose of our meeting instead of getting into the weeds, as I said. So please feel free to come forward. And we will have a timer.
My name is Greg Smith. I live at 1365 Box Elder Drive. My dear sweet wife, Michelle, grew up here in Alpine, and her family moved here 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. Michelle and I moved to our home. We moved to Alpine 17 years ago. We rented a house just a few blocks from here, and we looked for a permanent home. I got excited every time a home opened up near Lambert Park. The real estate market was hot then, like now. So Michelle and I went to see the house we ended up buying. She went to see it without me. After she saw it, I said, "Did you like it?" And she said she did. I said, "Then let's make an offer." I knew I liked it because it was near Lambert Park. So I think Lambert Park is very important. I encourage you not to sell any of it. I don't know whether we need a conservation easement to prevent that from happening. I used to go biking all over Lambert Park, but not so much anymore in the southern part. Lambert Park Estates has permanently changed the southern part of Lambert Park. We may be a little late for a conservation easement. Thinking of the presentation here, there were a couple of nice pictures of the Lambert ruin. What I noticed is that the North Mountain wasn't clearly visible in any of the pictures. It has to be cropped out because now there are a bunch of houses there and a detached garage that sticks way out near the Lambert ruin. The southern part of the park has already been compromised. I don't want you to sell it, but it's not what it used to be. I would encourage you to finish paving the last little segment of Moyle Drive and connecting it to Box Elder Way. Moyle was never meant to be a dead-end road. It's a big, wide arterial road, not a little feeder. It was in the city's master plan 50 years ago. I don't know if the master plan has been altered, but it was clearly laid out to handle more traffic than it has now. What would happen to Lambert Park? A couple of little trail crossings would cross a paved road. Now on the north end of Lambert Park, the trail already crosses a paved road and it works just fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And while the next person is coming forward, I just want to make one point of clarification. And I made this mistake when I first moved here, thinking that parts of Lambert Park that are not part of the park, really, that are private property, there are pieces that are still yet to be developed that are private, not part of the park. And so that dirt road that goes straight east from the Stake Center up to the mountain, that's really kind of the dividing lines, a few feet on the other side. But one of the reasons I feel it's important for us to look at this is that Lambert will continue to be hemmed in by development. And you had mentioned the Lambert Estates subdivision. That was always private. We were allowed to use it for a while with our trails, and all of us were disappointed to see it closed off and then developed. But that's just kind of the way it goes with private versus public land. And we love to, we love our private landowners for allowing us to use their land while they are willing to do that and use those trails. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, most of my comments are in the weeds. So I'll save that for the future, the management plan and the overuse and all that.
Name, please.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg Link, 13300 Grove Drive. So I'm the recipient of all the traffic you guys have created on Grove Drive by letting them develop above me. I applaud what you're doing. The thing I want to go on record for is that the assumption of the average person, and I guess Greg Gordon made the comment that the public was asking, are you going to develop Lambert Park? I mean, there's a lot of rumors, but the consensus of the citizens here, the assumption is this was not an issue, that the park was not vulnerable. All of us were sold by my friends in the real estate business as if it was a permanently protected piece of property. So it'll be news to a lot of the other citizens if we accurately, can persuade them or inform them that it is vulnerable and it needs to be protected. So I really applaud the fact that you're doing a conservation easement. And I think that it will be well supported. I think the use of it, the overuse of it and the traffic are other issues that are in the weeds, as you say, but they can be addressed not necessarily as a condition to the conservation. The conservation easement really validates what we all assumed was already in place and didn't know that it was vulnerable. And most of the citizens that I talked to today were completely flat-footed that it was vulnerable, like 9 out of 10. And these are informed, bright citizens that have been here. I've been here 32 years. Most of these guys around that amount of time. So I guess that's my buzzer. But yeah, the rest is in the weeds. The overuse thing, I posted online that I saw 50 people up there this morning. I was short by 150, and that's where I met the mayor and got invited here.
Yeah, by the time I saw you, I had run into 3 or 4 of those big groups that we saw.
That's a whole other issue, and traffic's another issue, but they're important issues.
Yes.
And the one question I have for you, what does the city do? I know I mentioned to Jason when I first came in, Paige, I've driven to Arizona, to Phoenix. My parents live down there. So for 38 years, I've driven to Scottsdale twice a year, past the overlook there by Paige. And nobody knew about it. You could stop Dead Horse Point or whatever. Yeah, you could go there and nobody knew about it. And in the last 5 years, I built a home down in Sedona. And in the last 5 years, I've been going to Sedona a lot as I built that home. And cars were lined up on both sides of the road for miles. Paige, who controls the access to that, ended up building a parking lot and charging a fee to park there and limit the number of people that could show up. If the parking lot's full, you can't go.
Yeah.
You know, so it's just an example of what can happen. Social media is,
Yeah.
really been a.
And we'll get into the details of managing
Yeah.
that in future meetings. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who'd like to comment?
Hi, my name is Mike Johnson. I live at 686 Hampton Court. Moved to Alpine about 5 years ago from California with my family. And really just want to understand if there's anyone on the city council who's not in favor of a conservation easement, so I can help vote you out of office this fall. That's really all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you for that poignant comment. Thank you.
Is there an answer?
I'll voice my opinion. There's nothing in my mind that we should do that doesn't conserve and preserve our open space. Now, how we go about doing that is what we're discussing now. There is no reason why I would think that we would do anything different than preserving Lambert Park or any of our open space. We just recently had a request to sell some open space over by a piece of property.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come, we don't take that lightly here, any of us. I don't think any of us do. So,
But to your point, we were close.
we were
We were
close.
close to selling a piece of open space. So to I forget who mentioned, yeah, it isn't, the city can do it. The city could sell this. I mean, to your point, we're not planning on it,
Yeah.
but we were close on that one.
Yeah. And
I
it's,
love the comment about the current leadership not trusting the future leadership.
I did-
like that.
Steve, I did hear a little David Church come through in that comment.
That was actually the Utah County attorney who was talking about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So that sounds a little bit like David, I agree.
I'm Randy Hamilton. I live on Village Way.
Hi, Randy.
72, 36 years now. And I've seen some changes with attitude through all those years. And I am so pleased to see somebody taking a step that's gonna protect this, because my kids, I want us to be able to see this, and I don't think we can assume that attitudes won't change in government. I mean, I guess maybe that my conservativeness comes out, but I really believe that this needs to be done and protected. And I appreciate it. And I don't think any of us really would be keeping our responsibilities right if we don't remember that. So I'm stating the obvious, I know that, but I appreciate it very much.
It's great to hear that input. Thank you very much, Randy. This isn't a very lively group. You guys, you had your dinner?
Is there any opposing views in here for conservation? I'd love to hear it.
Like to get pros too.
My name is Brian Fruit. Have a lot in Alpine on Blue Spruce, but I live in Highland currently.
Okay.
I literally moved from Linden to this area just to ride mountain bikes and those trails. I own the 2 bike stores that are close by here, Timpanogos Sanctuary and Bike Peddler. And this is what is the attraction, right? This is what builds these nice jobs that are close by, you know, in the Silicon Slopes area. You know, they want to live by these kind of attractions. So, you know, keeping this as an asset is going to be crucial. And I'm excited that you guys are looking into this. I don't know what the best way to do it is, but I'm excited that there's a conversation going on about it. And I hope that we can find the best way to maintain it as this open area and have access, you know, to ride our bikes, or people like to hike and do those kind of things. So definitely would applaud you guys for continuing to push forward to try to guarantee this access in the future.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Excuse me. I think it's great to have people come in from outside Alpine too, to help express their appreciation for the park. And I know that there are people here in this room who live in Alpine, but in the opposite end of the city. I've heard some people suggest that Lambert Park was important to those who were close to it, but not necessarily to those who were not. I myself ride about 2 miles to get there 3 or 4 times a week. And I know there are others who live on the opposite ends of town, who have kids on the mountain biking teams, who have, you know, who take walks with their spouses and really enjoy that park. It's a phenomenal place. A few weeks ago, there was a bloom in Lambert Park of all the yellow, I don't know what they're called. Are those sago lilies? They're not sago
No,
lilies.
they're
They're the yellow.
That's Ken Bush.
I'll
Ed
ask,
would know.
if Ed was in the room, he'd identify it in a heartbeat. But yeah, but it was beautiful. I mean, you walk up there at very certain specific times of the year, you see different things, different blooms. And it's just there's nothing like being up there before sunrise and watching the sun hit the peaks. It's a fantastic feeling. So, you know, I'm not sure there's anybody in this room who would oppose us moving forward with the permanent protection of that park. And just to reiterate, there is no imminent threat today to Lambert Park. Everybody's committed to it, but you know, whether we distrust those in the future or just are afraid of any economic pressures that may occur that are unforeseen, you know, I think it's good to put our seal on it right now. Is there anybody else who'd like to come forward and comment? Vicki, I know you have something to say. Don't you have something to say? Come on up.
First of all,
Give us your name, please, Vicki.
Oh, Vicki Birchall, and we live at 340 Pineview Drive, Alpine. And we have been in Alpine almost 49 years. And first of all, I wish you could speak in English what we were saying. But it sounds like they don't make any profit. And if you can protect Lambert because I teach riding lessons and I bike there, ride there, and horses there, and I run there. And just really fast, to preserve this, and we've seen a lot of change. And I get my riding students up on the trails and I say, into Alpine, we used to hunt here, fish here, camp here and swim in the water hole there. And that's the way Alpine was. And Main Street was a dirt road and hitching post for our horses. Anyway, so really fast, if we can preserve this for the future, because I was, and one of those that thought it was totally safe, that was our last safe place, is to have Lambert property. And when you say overuse, I remember when they first got, and I'll hurry, when they first got the biker, the trails. And when they first got, the high schools got bikers up there. We were on the horses and I had about 4 students behind me on horses. And I said, oh, here comes a couple of bikers. Let's just, and we always get off the trail for the bikers with the horses. And so a couple of bikers, 125 bikers later. and just so you know, I loved every single minute of it. I said, you guys, we can't look, here's more, here's more, here's more. And I did not know that the high schools had biking. And it was awesome to see all those bikers. And at the very last was one of the instructors. And I said, you guys, this has been so much fun watching. So if we can just be lenient with the runners, the horses, and the bikers. And I'm not sure what you mean by overuse, but if we can all share it and be happy with whatever is up there.
Well,
But,
and to clarify
Vicky.
with the overuse, Mayor, if I
Yeah, go
may,
ahead.
yeah,
the high school teams, yes, there's a lot of them. But they do have a schedule and they have a spreadsheet that everyone can get access to. So you can see what their schedule is so you can avoid them. And that's what I do. I don't necessarily like being there with 200 people. But at the same time, those kids are there and we are doing our part as a community. Excuse me, because our high school team goes to Pleasant Grove, they go out to Eagle Mountain, they go out to Draper. And so we have to be willing to allow other communities to come and practice on our trails, just as they're welcoming us. So, we do need to be part of a greater community. I know that, it's Lambert Park and it's ours, and I love it just as much as everybody else. But I think at the same time, we do need to be a little bit more open. And I get it. If you don't want to ride or be there with 200 kids, just look up their schedule. If you want to know.
where's this?
I know, I have to look it up.
It's on the mountain bike.
Yeah, it's, I think I have it. I'll send it to you.
The high school coaches have it. In fact, I spoke to the American Fork
Yeah.
Hospital.
It's an Excel
high school
spreadsheet, so
coaches
make sure
today.
that you look at all the tabs for the different months.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's all over Utah, even into Park City, because sometimes I'll drive up there to ride, but I definitely don't want to be with 200 people.
Yeah, and,
So you
and
can avoid it.
Yeah,
and
it
to that
doesn't
point,
bother me a bit. Thank you.
we had, up until 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, there were no high school mountain biking teams. And they started, I know the Lone Peak team started with 5 kids. And within 3 or 4 years is up to over 100. And now it's pushing 200. The great thing about that sport, and I don't love running into them either. This morning, I had to find alternate routes everywhere, all through the park. It can be. But the reality is this is a sport that is more inclusive than any sport I know of. You have people with disabilities who are still able to ride a mountain bike. High school kids that never would play another high school sport are into mountain biking and they're accepted. And there's no tryouts. It's just everybody's welcome. You ride in the appropriate class. If you want to talk about girls in sports, it's awesome because the girls are out there kicking the boys' trash all the time on these trails. They're doing great. And it's fun to see that. It's fun to see the enthusiasts out there, and it's a lifetime sport. It's a sport that you take way beyond high school and with your families that are in the future.
So the website is utahmtb.org/trails. And if you go to the bottom of it, you'll have the spreadsheet.
Great.
utahmtb for mountainbike.org/trails.
And if I remember correctly, Mayor, you've talked to the mountain bike teams and told them not to come on certain days.
Correct.
So
We
there's
have
some days they'll never be there.
Yeah, we do have an agreement with the teams, and sometimes they lose track of some of the details, which is why it was great to have an opportunity to speak to the American Fork High School coaches today. Because one of the primary things we want to do is make sure that they have their time, but so do the residents. And so we've asked them not to come on Friday, Sunday, or Monday evenings. And also for only one team to use Lambert Park at a time, so that we don't have multiple teams, because that's when it really creates a problem. And when you do have Lambert Park, whatever, if you bring 200 kids, you need to find 20 trails, because we've asked for them to have a max of 10 riders per group on the trail, so that when you run into them, it's, you know, it's not too long before you can get around them, or they get around you.
And each school only comes to Lambert Park once a month.
Yeah, it's on a rotational
Yeah.
basis. And
So
and
they're
all aware
only
of that.
here once a month from each school. So, you know, Pleasant Grove will come here once a month, American Fork will come here once a month, Lehigh. So it's not as,
Yeah, and to your point earlier, the great thing about this is, you know, we've had Lambert Park for a long time, but other communities have started to create their own trail systems that didn't exist before. So our kids are going to those trails. I go to those trails, and it's nice to be able to hop around.
Discussion, we're gonna have a separate agenda. I do my powder dry.
Okay, touche. I'll move on. Is there anybody else who'd like to make a comment before we wrap up the meeting? Please.
Hi, Michelle Smith, 1365 Box Elder Drive. I just wanted to say that I'm not sure if October is like, it seems like that might be a little fast in getting everybody's comments, because like with regard to the road, I mean, we've got a solution has to be worked out on getting an alternative road out of Box Elder South. It continues to grow and the traffic continues to get worse. And so, you know, whether it's on Moyle Drive, which I would prefer, that was what was in the plan, and that's what we would prefer, but it, you know, one option would, you know, I've heard is that it could come in south of that too, another road out. And I was talking to Brian Hoffines, who said that what about putting in a tunnel under that a connection road between Box Elder South and Moyle Park, so that nobody has to stop. But I know I've had several neighbors write in about this issue to you guys, and they haven't got any kind of a response. And, you know, I just want to make sure that everybody is represented here. So that's my thought.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, Michelle, and that's part of the weeds and part of the management discussion, not the conservation. We need to separate the two issues.
Right.
But we do need to manage the traffic. I mean, I walk up Grove Drive every morning at 6:45 and I have to flag down the damn trucks to get them even close. They're going 50. They're not going 30.
Yeah.
They're going 50. So we really do need to address this or somebody's going to get killed.
Thank you for
And I
bringing
don't
that
want
up.
to be that person. One last question, if, to your point about surveys and information and all that, this is hopeless. This doesn't tell you guys anything.
We'll have better surveys in the future. And thank you for the heads up on the speeding trucks, because we can ask our police chief to beef up enforcement in that area, especially for commercial.
I promised to bring one of their trailers over.
Yeah,
2 weeks ago, I haven't seen it yet.
but we need tickets, not trailers, in my opinion. Sorry.
Yeah, we just need to start to educate people. that,
Yeah.
you know,
Shane, can we make that a brief part of our meeting tomorrow morning? Okay, thank you for those comments. If there's no one else who wants to come forward, I think I'm ready to wrap up the meeting. Does anybody else on council have any more comments? Greg, we can't see you. Do you have anything else you'd like to bring up?
No, thank you. It's been a very good and informative meeting. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Well, with that, we'll bring a conclusion to the meeting. I'll need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion, we adjourn.
I'll second.
Motion by Lon, second by Carla. All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Greg?
Ayes have it.
I said aye, yeah. Thank